Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome. Thank you for joining us for what is our last public event of the year on a very interesting conversation looking at protecting U.S. intellectual property and innovation leadership, featuring a good friend, Lori Self from Qualcomm, and David Kapos, former Undersecretary of Commerce. I'm going to ask Dan Mahaffey to give them a little more introduction in just a moment, but I wanted to welcome you for our conversation today. The topic is very relevant to a series of discussions that the center has hosted over the last several years under our geotechnology competition umbrella, where we were looking at ways we can bolster American national security by studying and understanding various elements of technology competition, what it takes to keep the United States in a position of competitiveness in some of the key technologies that actually determine the future of our national security. We have grappled with some of the more obvious angles of the question, including looking at how we compete with adversaries, how our economy it can invest in critical technologies, supply chain challenges, and other aspects that relate more obviously to national security, including how we work with allies and how we compete with countries that have systems where the government and business interests are very closely linked, and one kind of drives the other. Competing in a way that works well for a pluralistic democracy in a market economy, but also being cognizant of ways that we can maintain our innovation advantage in the protection of that national security. We're also now delving into some more non-obvious areas, including ways we can contribute to that innovation by ensuring that the rules that we use to shape our policy protect intellectual property and continue to allow the players in our economy to continue to innovate and produce these new technologies that keep us on the cutting edge. There's a lot that goes into that. We've got some great speakers to talk to us about some perspectives on that today. So welcome. And with that, let me turn it over to Dan Mahaffey for a further intro on the topic and set up our speakers for today. Dan?
Thank you, Glenn, and thank you to our speakers and you all in the audience as well for joining us. First of all, let me extend as well season's greetings to everyone as we are approaching the end of the year. I want to say, as the leader of our Geotech program, I'm very proud of our efforts to educate policymakers and the public alike about the geopolitical competition for technology leadership, its future relationship to our economic prosperity and national security, and the policy options that best support continued U.S. and allied innovation leadership. To that end, I'm excited for this conversation we are about to have at the nexus of intellectual property, innovation leadership, and national security. In many ways, this is a discussion that is as old as the Republic itself, one that the founding fathers understood, as they both, in the Constitution, we have specific enumeration of both patents and the national security responsibilities of our leaders. They understood the role that this plays in defending the country and securing the patents and intellectual property of innovators, entrepreneurs, and artists. At the same time now, we find ourselves in a heated geotech competition where IP policies play a key role in the innovation ecosystem for great American companies, as well as incentivizing next generation breakthroughs in critical technologies for our national security, such as 5G and eventually 6G networks, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotech, the panoply of green technologies, and the list goes on. While government and the private sector both race for leadership and to make breakthroughs in these fields, this discussion will look at how IP policy changes can promote or disrupt future R&D plans, encourage or dissuade U.S. companies' leadership in international standards bodies, support or weaken international IP protection, and protect or cheapen the value of innovators' time, sweat, and treasure. Simply put, in the geotech race, how do we avoid policies and IP that have us proverbially or metaphorically hitting the gas and the brake at the same time? To discuss this, we have a great panel today. I'm pleased to welcome Lori Self, the Vice President and Counsel of Government Affairs at Qualcomm, where she specializes in U.S. patent policy at the federal and state level. And based in D.C., she also supports Qualcomm's government affairs initiatives to support strong intellectual property rights in emerging markets. David Capos is a partner at Kravith and a leader in the field of intellectual property, including IP management and strategy, the development of global IP norms, laws and practices, and the commercialization and enforcement of innovation-based assets. From 2009 to 2013, Mr. Capos served as the Undersecretary of Commerce and Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, where he advised the President on IP policy matters. He was instrumental in the 2011 Leahy-Smith America Invents Act passage, and before that time, he served as IBM's Chief Intellectual Property Lawyer. So I want to thank you both, and I'll turn it over to you, David, first to get us started, please.
Yeah, well, thanks, Dan, and thanks, Glenn, and great to see you, Lori, and pleasure to be with you. This is a really important discussion, and thanks to the center for pursuing this. I can't think of anything more important at this point than the nexus between innovation and national security. You know, in reflecting on and preparing for this panel, I was noticing this wasn't the discussion we were having 5 years ago, but it is a discussion we're having now. And it's a discussion we need to have more. And by the way, it's a discussion that other countries are beginning to have as well. What I would reflect about the impact of innovation on national security is that the two are not just linked together, but they are essentially alter egos of one another. National security has always been based on technology leadership. It has since long before the U.S. was a country. It has since before anyone had sophisticated machinery. And as machinery has become more sophisticated, technology has continued to be the determinant for who wins and loses in conflict, who leads economically, who has the soft power and influence to be able to shape the world order, and who doesn't. And it should strike us as no surprise that that is the case today. The role of intellectual property is very simple. It provides the incentive, economic incentive for sources of funding to become available to take great ideas and put them into the marketplace, or in the case of national security, into the national security apparatus, if you're talking about the military side of it. It's always been the role of intellectual property. And it's a very simple proposition that where intellectual property protections are weakened, there will be less investment in innovation, right? There's a great study put out a few years ago by Steve Haber, a Stanford professor at the Hoover Institute over there, that found that in the entire history of the world, there is no example of a country having weak intellectual property protection and strong economic output. And there is no example in history of a country having strong intellectual property protection and weak economic output. It's just that simple. The two go together. And as some of my clients here in New York will lecture me from time to time in the venture funding and private equity and businesses that bring large amounts of capital over great ideas, the way they put it is, look, they say it's simple. If the intellectual property system can offer superior returns, we will deploy billions, tens of billions, and hundreds of billions of dollars of capital into otherwise risky, difficult technology ventures. But if you can't, with the intellectual property system, deliver the exclusivity, the market advantage that makes it worthwhile for us to invest, we will buy pork belly futures. That's exactly the way these issues are treated by the economic community that marshals the investments that either make us leaders or make us losers. So the other thing, Dan, that I would say is that in my view, we're living in an era right now, the last several years, of incredible cognitive dissonance. What do I mean by that? Put it in the vernacular, this stuff just doesn't make sense to me. So let me give you a few examples. On the one hand, we're all over our economic competitors, especially China, rightly so, to respect American intellectual property. Stop ripping off our IP. Stop with the cyber espionage. Stop with the forced technology transfer, et cetera, et cetera. And that is as it should be. The playing field needs to be leveled, and American IP, just like all IP, needs to be treated with respect. But what gives me the cognitive dissonance is, on the other hand, at the same time, we are ourselves spontaneously devaluing our intellectual property. So it's as if we're saying to other countries, we want you to respect this stuff that we think is worth less and less all the time. That makes no sense. We should be doing exactly the opposite and buttressing the value of the IP. Second area of cognitive dissonance, intellectual property is an incredibly positive component of our trade balance. Everyone knows the US has a huge trade deficit. It would be even much larger if it weren't for the fact that we have a huge surplus in the intellectual property area, because we have historically led the world in creating good ideas, great ideas, breakthroughs, and we then get to license them to other countries, and we repatriate those royalties, and that leads to a positive trade balance with intellectual property. Cognitive dissonance. Why in the world would we be devaluing such an important asset class that is the source of this incredible trade positive balance for the US? It makes no sense, but that's exactly what we're doing. And then lastly, Dan, to come to your point about national security, we know from the previous administration, and I think they got this exactly right, that there are some core technologies that are fundamental to US national security: artificial intelligence, 5G, quantum computing, to name a few that I'm aware of that have been specifically identified by our national security apparatus. So, cognitive dissonance. We know these are critical technologies for national security. So why would we be devaluing, right, the intellectual property that underlies those technologies? But that's exactly what we're doing when we take aim at standard essential patents and I will say the brave companies that invest their R&D dollars into technologies and then contribute them to standards in the hope that they will someday in the future recoup some of that investment through royalty returns from licensing the intellectual property. The companies that do that are actually, they should be heralded as American heroes. This is an act of selflessness and bravery as I see it. And I don't want it to become an act of foolishness as we devalue our intellectual property system and prevent these folks from getting a return on their investment. They're not dumb. They won't make the same mistake twice. And we will see, American companies, as they have been, fleeing from these risky investments, leaving them to our overseas competitors, right? And that comes back to my theme, cognitive dissonance. It makes absolutely no sense, having identified these technologies as critical to national security, knowing, as we well know, that unless you have strong intellectual property rights available to protect them, no one is going to invest in them in this country, but they certainly will in other countries where they are strengthening their intellectual property systems. So it just makes no sense that we would be going in such a retrograde direction on intellectual property when we know full well that it is so critical to our economic well-being and to our national security. And I'll stop there. Oh, you're on mute, Dan.
Thanks, David. And yeah, got the mute there. Always the smartest thing I say is when I'm on mute. No, but you described perfectly that relationship between national security, the rules of intellectual property, and in describing the companies, as you said, that are on the cutting edge of this innovation. I think that segues perfectly to Lori, your perspective on not only the overall relationship between IP and the innovation ecosystem, but as we point out, these policies that are cognitive dissonance, the break-in gas at the same time.
Yeah, and thank you, Dan and Glenn, for inviting me to participate in this important discussion. And I could not agree more with everything that Dave articulated. And I just want to say at the outset, to echo his comments, that the very fact that we're having this conversation that positions intellectual property as the kind of cornerstone of a strong innovation economy, a cornerstone of economic and national security, that in and of itself is a really important insight. Unfortunately, as Dave said, that is often misunderstood or ignored altogether in Washington. Too often, intellectual property is treated as ancillary to these issues around technology, leadership, national security, or wholly unrelated. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with policymakers where, they talk about the importance of these critical technology sectors to economic and national security, but intellectual property policy is not even, in their, mindset as they think about what we need to do to accomplish those objectives. So Qualcomm is the world's leading developer of cellular technology. So when we think about what 5G is, what 4G, 3G, we're in terms of leading up to this evolutionary and revolutionary shift towards 5G, the foundational inventions that have driven this incredible mobile ecosystem were created in significant part by Qualcomm. We are first and foremost the R&D engine of the US global mobile ecosystem. Our company is predominantly driven by engineers who form the best minds, if you will, in this highly complex field of cellular technology. And our mission is to do the advanced pre-commercial R&D that ultimately forms each what they call standard of cellular technology. So just to build on the comments that Dave made, we as a commercial company, as a publicly traded company, we make the decision to make these huge upfront investments in R&D long before those investments reach the standards bodies and long before they reach the marketplace. That has always been our mission. That will always be our mission. But our ability to fulfill that mission is critically dependent on a strong intellectual property system. So just to kind of unpack what I mean by that. When you're talking about doing upfront R&D, of course, you have to have the engineering wherewithal to do that. And there are very few companies in the world today that have that, that sort of core technological know-how in cellular communications. Each generation of cellular standardized technology it requires about 10 years of advanced R&D. So if you think about, we're in the kind of midway in a 10-year standardization process around 5G. The R&D that is built into our standard was, in a lab 10 years ago within Qualcomm, as we thought about what technological breakthroughs are necessary to create a 5G paradigm shift, if you will. So 4G was all about massive increases in mobile broadband. It's what converted your mobile device into this incredible platform for streaming, computing, really the most important computing device, in your arsenal, if you will. 5G was all about innovation breakthroughs that will enable an ecosystem and an economy, if you will, in which cellular technology becomes a connective fabric for everything. So device to device, machine to machine. We've heard a lot about connected auto, factories of the future, IoT. That is, again, that's a revolutionary change in the capabilities of cellular communications. And to enable that, there was a tremendous amount of R&D and previously thought, inconceivable advances in technology that have driven this 5G ecosystem. So that R&D is funded entirely by, in our case at least, funded entirely by Qualcomm. We fund that R&D through our patents and our ability to license our patented technologies broadly. So, as we complete the R&D, as the standardization process begins, when you talk about cellular communications, you're talking about communications that require a kind of global consensus, if you will, a kind of global blueprint in terms of how those technologies will work together, how they will kind of enable carriers and other implementers of those technologies to utilize those technologies, to deploy them. That's why standardization is so important. So the R&D drives leadership in the standards. The advanced R&D becomes a kind of blueprint for what technologies are adopted into the standard. That standardization process is another 10-year process of, again, iterative improvements in the capabilities of the standard. And the only way you, as that investor in the R&D, as that driver of the R&D, obtain revenues to continue that R&D or to fund that return on investment is through the patents that we obtain and our ability to license our patents and the standardized technologies broadly. So that has always been Qualcomm's business model. Hopefully it will continue to be our business model, but it's what has enabled these kind of rapid transformative leaps in cellular communications over the past 30 years. This is the most important technological platform that has ever been created by mankind. I know that sounds somewhat hyperbolic, but it's true. Think back in terms of what technology was capable of 30 years ago versus what it's capable of today. Think about how we have managed to continue our global economy through this unprecedented global pandemic that is largely a function of these rapid increases in the capabilities of cellular connectivity. But again, as a US-based, market-based company, our ability to justify those long horizons, big bet investments in R&D are critically dependent on a strong patent system. And as you think about how that ecosystem of innovators has evolved, in 2021, our leading competitors in this foundational technology space are predominantly Asian companies and predominantly a Chinese company that's well known to your audience. Those companies, those Chinese entities, are making significant investments in R&D, significant investments in standards, because they recognize that the companies that control the standards, the foundational technologies, will have a tremendous position, if you will, in driving all economic activity, all benefits, if you will, that will utilize those 5G technologies. And so, in a country like China, you see this very kind of holistic, sort of top-down approach to the policies that are critical to this, shift away from a manufacturing economy and to a true innovation economy. The US historically has benefited tremendously from a strong system of intellectual property rights codified in our Constitution, a strong rule of law. That has been our differentiator since the beginning of this country. And we've lost sight of that, candidly, with these kind of fragmented, disjointed policy shifts, as Dave was articulating. So until we as a country recognize that we need consistency, stability, strength in our patent system, that has to be table stakes for every administration, no matter what your party, these should not be treated as partisan issues subject to the political winds. We all have to recognize that strong intellectual property rights are foundational, not only in terms of our ability to incentivize innovation in this country, but importantly, to compete globally in these critical technology sectors. So understanding the continuum between a strong intellectual property system, investments in R&D, leadership in standards, being able to utilize that technology leadership position to benefit other industry sectors, and importantly, to support our defense and military leaders, I think is a critical dimension in terms of our ability to drive policies that enable success in these important sectors. So I'll stop there, Dan.
I know that Dan has several questions for both of you, and I also know that he is going to solicit input from audience in terms of questions. So I want to give people a heads up that if they would like to pose questions for Dan to put to the speakers today, please go ahead and submit them using the Q&A function. But I'm hoping Dan will allow me to jump in just for a moment and maybe ask one question each of our speakers. And Lori, I'm going to come back to you in a moment because I'm really interested in your thoughts from Qualcomm's perspective on some of the key national security implications of this question of protecting patents and investment. But let me just go back first to David. You started by saying the conversation's changed significantly over recent years. And I'm wondering if you could just dig in a little more on what is the nature of the change in the conversation? What's driving that? Is it the rapid development of the technologies? Is it something to do with the global marketplace? Is it policy changes that have come online recently? You've been following the policy side of this for many years now. How do you see this changing in recent years?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. Great question. I think in this space, there's a bit of a mega trend that's been underway, and then there's been some sectoral or sub trends within it. The mega trend has been the incredible amount of power of the implementer community. So literally the richest companies in the world, and you can easily reel them off. Just go look at the very, very, very richest companies in the world that are in the role of implementing standards. And to be fair, that's an important role, and they make great products and services. But as we say in New York, when you're a hot dog vendor, you want the mustard to be free. And similarly, with the implementers, they have had a strategy, and it's just a business strategy. It's okay. I'm not casting aspersions here, but their business strategy is to drive their input prices down. And the chips that go into these incredible devices that Lori was talking about, our smartphones and and the networking equipment around them, are inputs to the implementers. And the intellectual property that enables those chips to be so great are inputs to the innovator community. And so they have methodically worked to drive prices down, and they've been in the mega trend. I think they've been somewhat successful at that. And one of the tools that they've used is weakening the intellectual property system for the very reasons that both Lori and I have discussed. So that's been the mega trend. I think in general, there is a second mega trend that needs to be mentioned, which is the incursion of antitrust doctrine into this space. And that megatrend started about 20 years ago or so, when a series of predictions, basically, I would say speculation by antitrust scholars, led to an extant view in the Antitrust Academy, but then also in the regulatory bodies in the US, and then it easily spread globally, that patents contributed to standards were suspect, and the motives and behaviors of the patent holders were suspect, and the antitrust apparatus needed to provide a counterweight to those suspected suspects or speculative suspects. And so we've seen a methodical set of incursions and new doctrines created on the part of antitrust authorities, first in the US and to a significant extent in tandem in Europe, and then spreading overseas, where it's a very convenient message to bring antitrust principles to bear, because it's overseas in places like China where they're primarily paying royalties. So if you've got a new set of laws that are naturally malleable, like the antitrust laws, and you can use them to take aim and reduce input costs for standard essential patents, that seems like a no-brainer, and it was a no-brainer. So those are the mega trends that have more or less gone in an unfortunate diminishing direction vis-a-vis intellectual property. The sectoral trend, though, that was positive until really just this year was in the particularly in the antitrust area in the U.S., but to a significant extent in Europe too. And I think Europe is continuing to do better in this regard than the U.S. A recognition first by the antitrust authorities, but also by IP authorities, that these standard essential patent holders are actually doing something really important and really great. And in fact, those implementers are just operating on their own competitive, selfish motives, and we don't blame them for that. That's what for-profit companies do. But we as regulators and jurists, the judges in countries like Germany in particular, and the EC and the European Court of Justice, deduced that neither side of the equation was right or wrong, good or bad. They're just all parties operating in their competitive self-interest. And they started putting in place rules, and those rules were then promulgated in the US too, to say that, look, both parties in this delicate set of interests around standard essential patents, the innovators and the implementers, need to behave in good faith. And indeed, the implementers, while they have caused attention to be shifted toward the innovators, the implementers are taking advantage of the system themselves, and they're doing things that sure are in their competitive best interest, but are not exactly good for good policy. And so it was when that was finally figured out, really, and I really think it was like around 5 years ago or so, that you began seeing policy shift in antitrust authorities in Europe and the US and elsewhere saying, okay, we're going to level the playing field here. We're not going to favor anybody. We're going to be very balanced about this. And so you saw much better policy come into place in the previous administration. And then, unfortunately, in the last year, we've seen what I'm observing as a new trend that's going again in the downward or diminishing direction, where the antitrust authorities in the US, quickly followed by those overseas, are now once again saying, we're not really sure that that the activities of the patent holders are something that should be treated on an equal playing field with the activities of the implementers. And so we're going to start revisiting all this stuff. And it just feels very political to me. As Lori mentioned, this should not be an issue of R versus D politics. It's an issue of long-term good policy for our country. But it feels like what's going on now is the administration is just basically trying to undo everything that was done in the past on the basis of, look, we just want to undo it because the other guys did it, and so we're going to undo it. And I think that's very unfortunate. But that's a fairly complete answer to your question, Glenn. Mega trends and micro trends.
No, thanks for unpacking that. And Lori, just coming back to you on your closing point about the implications for defense and national security, for the benefit of our audience, some of whom may not be quite as well read in on this topic as others, can you just explicitly help us understand if companies like Qualcomm didn't or couldn't put the investment in R&D into the innovation that they do, what would be the key, in your estimation, impacts on defense and national security?
Yeah, and so let me answer that question both from kind of a more sort of micro perspective of what is the role that a company like Qualcomm plays in helping to support our national security interest leadership. We are not a defense contractor. That's never been our mission. But what we do serve as is a trusted advisor to our Defense Department, and in particularly in helping them understand the trajectory of cellular communications, the capabilities of cellular communications, really giving them insight into the technology and the technological roadmap that we have a unique perspective on because we invented it, right? I mean, it's, if you're the architect of the building, you're going to understand the blueprint of that building better than anyone else. Extrapolate that to a highly complex field of technology. If you are controlling the R&D roadmap in that highly complex field of technology, you can provide insight into that technology and help support the objectives of our defense national security community in ways that no other company, stakeholder in the world can. And losing that position, losing that leadership position in that R&D roadmap, if you will, is highly problematic from a defense national security perspective, particularly when you're talking about, again, a dynamic where there are a diminishing number of US companies that are investing large amount of R&D dollars, efforts into this important space of technology, and an increasing number of Chinese Asian companies that are doing so. Obviously, one of the reasons why a country like China is so laser focused on 5G and other areas of emerging tech is because they understand that dimension. Now, kind of broadening the lens a bit, if you think about what cellular roadmap, that cellular R&D roadmap is and enables, you're talking about the connectivity, the connective fabric, if you will, that not only will drive smartphone to smartphone communications, but in a 5G world, it will become the connective fabric of our manufacturing economy, our agricultural economy, our transportation systems, our infrastructure. So again, understanding the capabilities and also the vulnerabilities of that cellular roadmap is critically important from an economic and national security perspective. Also, as a company that believes deeply in a rule of law and the values of this country, controlling that, helping to drive that technological roadmap, helping to decide what security features, what capabilities we build into that technological roadmap blueprint, I think is a really important dimension of national economic security. And of course, Glenn, as you well know, there's never been a kind of clean line between issues of economic security and national security. That intersection between what we are achieving through commercial technology and what our goals are in the national security realm, there's an interconnectedness today that is more important, more pronounced than ever before. So, we live in a time where commercial technology leaders are going to be driving the R&D and driving the investments that will create the technologies critical to our national security objectives, our defense objectives. That is just the reality in which we live. The 20th century may have been a period in which defense dollars, drove the space race, and those technological advances, helped form advances in the commercial sector. that dynamic is turned on its head in the 21st century, where it's really the commercial technology leaders that are going to be predominantly driving those advances that are critical to our defense, national security stakeholders. So again, the commercial companies that are driving that R&D roadmap will have tremendous, the benefits in terms of having that roadmap begin in the United States, I think are myriad and essential from a U.S. national security perspective.
Thank you.
Glenn, I would just, if it's okay,
Yeah,
I would
ahead,
just
David.
add to that. There's a great report that came out, I want to say last year, from the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence that went through those points that Lori's raised. I mean, it's about leadership. And if you lead, you're setting the rules, you're setting the pace, you're ensuring proper security. And if you don't, you're not. And right, there's the old adage, if you're the lead sled dog, the view's a lot different from if you're anything other than the lead sled dog. Mm-hmm. And that fundamentally was what this National Security Commission came out with, very strong links between the need for a strong intellectual property system to support innovation in national security industries like 5G.
Thank you. Let me turn it back over to Dan here.
Thanks, Glenn. And Lori, I'll go first to you. We've focused on this issue of standard essential patents. We also talk about the need for leadership in these standards bodies. Just to dive in a little further for Qualcomm, how does your decision-making change on, and perhaps you can mention some of the bodies that you work with. How does your decision-making change when you see SEPs devalued or there's more questions about their future viability?
So let me, just by way of context, and again, I think it's really important to just to emphasize that standardization is preceded by significant investments in R&D by those handful of companies. In the West, it's predominantly Qualcomm, Nokia, Ericsson. There are other InterDigital, other players, but for in terms of Western participation in standards, you have to be able to sustain those pre-commercial investments in R&D, even to participate as an innovator in the standards in a meaningful way. And as Dave said, we have a growing number of implementers who come into standards bodies to understand the technology, to learn about the technology, ultimately to deploy the technology. But it's a very small number of companies that are actually contributing the R&D that create the standard. We participate in about 200 standards bodies globally. Those consist of the kind of core cellular standards bodies like 3GPP. They also cover a broad range of related technologies, Bluetooth, Wi-Fi. Increasingly, you have standards organizations, what are sometimes called consortia, that are created around certain vertical deployments of standards like connected auto. So it's a very complex, dynamic ecosystem of standards. And of course, as a publicly traded company, we have to be able to convince our executives, our board, our shareholders that those R&D investments will ultimately yield a return on investment. And again, that's where patents become critically important. And by the way, in other countries, non-market-based economies, you don't see those same market pressures. There's much more of a kind of top-down subsidization of R&D. And that's not something we want to emulate. We want to have R&D, I think, driven in kind of a grassroots, if you will, way, incentivized by property rights. But the reality is it creates market pressures that other competitors don't have. I think, Dan, it's not so much of a like day decision, okay, we'll participate in standards body X because policies say Y. It's much more the kind of climate, if you will, that it creates for our licensing business. And we have the world's most valuable, largest patent licensing business in cellular and related technologies. That's what drives the revenue that funds our R&D engine. These policy changes can have profound implications in terms of what they incentivize or disincentivize in other markets. Namely, do other countries feel emboldened or discouraged to devalue standardized technologies? As Dave was saying, when we were living in the midst of these very skeptical antitrust policies in the space of standardized technologies, you saw countries in parts of Asia essentially using that policy shift in the US to justify the use of antitrust as a kind of industrial policy tool to drive down the value of our patented technologies. We lived through that in a very profound way. It had, a huge impact on our revenues, our market position, our stock value. It candidly led, to situations where we had to, rethink hiring decisions. Which are, when you think about what R&D dollars are, those are essentially engineers. R&D dollars are essentially engineers. You're talking about a small group of highly educated, world-class cellular, other types of engineers who contribute to R&D in this space. So at the end of the day, these policies, which impact the decisions of foreign governments in terms of how they treat US technology leaders, it also obviously impacts the decisions of the companies that license our technologies. Do they pay? Don't they pay? How much are they willing to pay? Do they take us to court? So you can, we've seen this movie before. We've lived it. We know how it plays out. And at the end of the day, the question is, does the global licensing IP environment, which is heavily influenced by what the US government does or doesn't do, what it says or doesn't say about intellectual property, is that a environment that supports and sustains the value of patent rights, the value of R&D that goes into standards, or does it devalue those investments? And it's a incredibly important policy dimension that really is fundamental to our ability to lead in these technology spaces. So at the end of the day, the question is, does that policy environment support our ability to maintain a world-class engineering workforce that can devote itself to the creation of these technologies? Or does it, disincentivize that dynamic? Ultimately that leads to decisions about which standards activities we can participate in. But, our goal, our mission, our objective always as a company is to drive forward cellular communications. And in fact, I mentioned to you that we're kind of midway in a 10-year 5G standardization process. As we maintain those R&D investments in 5G that will drive the kind of IoT roadmap of the next 5 years, we're also starting R&D activities in 6G, what will ultimately be 6G. And there's, constant pressure, as a publicly traded market-based company to ensure that we have policies that sustain those R&D investments. But I often say it's a marathon in terms of our ability to maintain this R&D roadmap over 10, 20, 30 years. And it's also a series of sprints because we're constantly competing, standard by standard, technology by technology, to make sure that our technology is the best, from an objective global perspective, that our technology will be adopted into a standard. That's a technological historically, standards have operated as a kind of technological meritocracy, as they should. But our ability to kind of out innovate and win that technology race is critically dependent on these policies that we're talking about.
David, please.
Yeah, one other way you asked the question of, so what happens when IP gets devalued? But we could actually flip the question and ask the question of what does the world look like when IP in this space has a high value? And I would tell you, it's it writ large, it's the cellular revolution that we witnessed, the greatest aggregate creation of consumer surplus in the history of mankind. And again, I know, as Lori said, it's hyperbolic, but it's actually true. You got to say it because it's true. And the ecosystems that have been created of large numbers of entrants into the marketplace in many countries, and this vibrant interlaced ecosystem of specialized research, development, chip manufacturing, assembly, device manufacturing, software, apps, now automobiles and other connected devices. It is the most dynamic business ecosystem in the history of mankind. It so far outstrips the previous generation of computing of sort of winner take all, right? Walled gardens, winner take all. There's one winner and everyone else go home. This economic model based on the contribution of IP into standards, if we can keep that golden goose going, right, it produces net aggregate human value that far surpasses anything in the past.
That's a great way to frame it, and I think a good way to build on that response and remarks. The other thing too from Lori's comments, David, that I'd like to get your thoughts on are, what are the signals? We send these signals to other countries and other entities, Europe, China. How are they responding to what we do in IP policy? How does that affect our competitiveness? And I want to fold into an audience question. What are we seeing in terms of Chinese respect for IP in the courts based on the signals we send?
Yeah, well, it boomerangs immediately. I had an experience as recently as last week where the morning after the US announced revisiting an important SEP policy that had been put out just in 2019, I was on a call on a panel with people in China about the Chinese intellectual property system, and a Chinese official immediately brought that up and immediately took it as a signal that they're going to watch and follow on the Chinese side. And I guess I say that not to blame them. It's obviously in their best interest. I don't expect them to do things not in their best interest, but we're just providing a roadmap to taking this critically important IP system in the wrong direction. So overseas authorities watch extraordinarily closely what's going on in the US, and they're very fast to adapt to it and to use it both as their policy and as their rhetoric. And I don't know if you want to go on to your other question, or did you want to go over to Lori?
Well, Lori, I would just add too, because you have expertise in developing world IP. What does this say too when we're competing for IP leadership and being an example for the developing world in this broader geotech competition?
Yeah, and we used to think about China as being the developing world, and now we look at China and they really are creating a kind of world-class R&D economy now. Just to build on Dave's points, I think the role that the United States historically has played is serving as a kind of gold standard, if you will, and standard bearer for the importance of a strong intellectual property system. And when we through policy shifts generate kind of self-inflicted wounds that diminish that position, it has, I think, a really important kind of destabilizing effect in terms of how intellectual property is treated, not just in our sector, but more broadly. So, if you think about all of the different technology sectors that we think of as highly R&D intensive, whether we're talking about biotech or cellular AI or what have you, I think, sending messages that intellectual property is sort of fair game, for industrial policy type attacks or any other kinds of attacks is really detrimental. Now, I just to that point, when I first started my career, many years ago, the kind of biggest threat vis-a-vis a country like China or other developing parts of the world was sort of outright theft your intellectual property. It would be copied, it would be, counterfeited, what have you. When we talk about patent intensive technology sectors, again, whether you're talking about 5G or biotech or what have you, what we're seeing in terms of US policies that signal a lack of appreciation or respect for intellectual property is the use of other industrial policy tools to drive down the value of intellectual property. And we've talked about antitrust being one such, very powerful mechanism for doing that. So using kind of antitrust rhetoric to essentially justify what is compulsory licensing or price regulation for R&D intensive technologies, patent intensive technologies. So, we've seen, when we've seen situations where those antitrust attacks, which again, we view as antitrust in name only, really industrial policy meant to appropriate or diminish the value of US intellectual property rights, those tend to have a kind of domino effect. They start in one country and then they go to another country and another country and another country. We lived through that, over the past decade. So, Dan, I think that the bottom line is when we as a country don't signal very strong support for intellectual property and a strong political policy commitment to defend the position of US technology leaders, there's a broad array of negative effects in countries throughout the world. And again, think about what an intellectual property right is. There's no patent police you can go to defend your intellectual property. You're talking about do implementers of that technology feel legal incentives, political incentives to respect intellectual property rights or not? That's a very fragile, if you will, dynamic, and it's wholly dependent on our commitment as a country to a strong rule of law, a strong system of property rights, a strong system of intellectual property rights. And when we waver in that commitment, it really does have a huge destabilizing effect that can manifest itself in different ways in different parts of the world.
Well, I see we're getting up to the very top of the hour, and this conversation could go on so much longer. I have so many great questions. I think we'll just have to reconvene in the new year further on this topic. I think we're just scratching the surface here, and it's an important conversation to continue to have, particularly too, as I know the policymakers are looking at things like USICA, other legislation moving ahead. We're going to continue to have this conversation, and Glenn, I'll turn it over to you for some closing thoughts.
I just want to say, Lori and Dave, thank you for being with us and sharing your expertise on this topic. It is an important one. It's one that some of our audience members don't spend their day dwelling on and don't necessarily understand all the ins and outs of. So it's important for us to have this conversation. Our focus at the center has been on American national security. And as I mentioned at the outset, some of the more obvious, but also some of the more non-obvious components of that. It is a complex equation compounded by rapidly developing technologies, many of which have very significant implications on national security. We talked about 5G, AI, quantum, and other areas where American innovation is vital. You finish first in 5G or you don't. You finish first in AI or you don't. And if you don't, your country's got significant problems in terms of security that it needs to deal with. We need to be thinking about all these facets before we reach that stage. So we're setting ourselves up for success. I appreciated Lori's comment about the terminology. We talk about geotechnology and national security, and sometimes we hold conversations with outside partners where we say, this is geotechnology, and they look at us and say, so basically you're talking about economic security. And we say, actually, you're right. There is an overlap in many ways between these issue areas. And we appreciate your being with us to help us understand these deep connections and help us think about it in a way that is that's productive and future focused. Thank you so much for your time. We look forward to continuing the conversation in 2022. In the meantime, wishing all of our our panelists, Dan, and the participants who were able to join us well, and happy holidays. And we'll look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks, Glenn. Yep. Thanks, Dan. Thanks,
Take care.
Lori. Bye.